This morning we're going to take a look at our first step. For those that don't know, step one simply says, we recognized that our lives had become a prison. Now, that would be a common theme that would run throughout open mic night here at Step 7. That there was one moment, one instant of epiphany, where we suddenly looked around and with eyes saw that our lives had become a prison. Another common theme that would run through everyone's story is, to a person, we were the absolute last one to understand that our lives had indeed become a prison. See, far before that, our families, our friends, the courts, employers, everyone who had any interest in us whatsoever had already come to this fact here, okay? And yet none of their words, none of their urging had any impact on us until we ourselves came to that understanding that our lives had become a prison. Another common theme that would run through everyone's story is the very next words out of our mouth was along the lines of David's prayer here in Psalms 142, verse 7, set me free from my prison. Let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to share your word. Lord, I pray that you would open everyone's eyes, everyone's heart to receive your word today. That, Lord, through it, you would teach us something new about you. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
We don't often know the circumstances around the Psalms that David wrote. But we do know here in Psalms 142 that David wrote this while it says he was in the cave. Now, there were a number of caves that played a part in David's life. And yet there was only one that holds the distinction of being the cave. See, it occurred at the lowest, darkest, most desperate time in David's life. Early on as a teenager, David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. All too quickly, his life began to take a trajectory that seemed to lead straight toward the throne room. Very quickly, he became a commander in Saul, the reigning king's army. He married one of Saul's daughters. He moved into the palace, just yards away from the throne room. He could see the steps before him. If you were able to bring David at this point in his life, he would tell you, I can see where God is leading me. And yet all too quickly, his life took a 180 and seemed to go the opposite direction. Suddenly Saul had nothing on his mind but to kill David the moment that he saw him. And so David began to run all over the country of Israel. And yet everywhere he went, somebody would rat him out that he was there. And suddenly Saul would show up with a bunch of warriors looking for him, and David had to escape time after time. David suddenly gets the bright idea that he'll go to the neighboring country of Gath. Surely there, no one will know him. He'll be able to just let the heat die down, get himself recentered, figure out what God's got going for him here, and begin again. He gets into Gath, and unfortunately, his reputation precedes him. Because David is known as a valiant warrior. David is known to the folks who are there, and they take him prisoner, and they're bringing him to the king of Gath, and they're going to present him to the king, and then tell the king, you know, you could probably get a pretty penny for this guy. You might be able to get some concessions, maybe some land, something like that. Let's go ahead and just basically give him over to Saul, who will kill him right here, probably in our presence, and we'll get something cool out of it. David escapes, and he goes to the one place that he can think of that no one will ever look for him. It's this wild, untamed wilderness, unclaimed by any sovereignty. And in the middle of this, he finds a cave, and he just goes inside, and he's all alone. And he has no idea what God's doing. He has no idea how this is going to work on his behalf. He can't see the throne room from here. And all he's got is God's promise that he is one day going to reign. And it's out of this that he pens Psalms 142. And I'm going to go ahead and read the entirety. It's only 7 verses. He says, I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. Pour out my complaint before him. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who know my way. In the path where I walk, men have hidden snares for me. Look to my right and see, no one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. Been there. Got a t-shirt. No one cares, David says, for my very life. I could die right now. No one would even worry. Now, David's parents are still alive at this point. David's brothers are all still alive at this point. Samuel is still alive, the one who anointed him to be king. There are those out there that care deeply for David. And yet, like so many men, if they're not right there in front of us, we just can't see them. And David's at this point where he thinks, no one even cares whether I live or whether I die. And it's out of this that he continues. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. About 4, maybe even 5 years ago now, Cindy Litz did the teaching up here one morning. Her sermon was simply titled, The Gift of Desperation. It is, I believe, still the most watched video on our YouTube channel. And I would urge you tomorrow, there are no football games, your dance card's completely open, so you might as well. Go to Step 7's YouTube and search either Cindy Litz or Desperation, and it will come up, and watch it. It's an incredible teaching that she did about God's gift of giving us that moment of desperation that makes us cry only to God because no one else is going to help. And David is at this point here. He says, I am in desperate, desperate need. He continues on. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Now, David was being physically chased by great big professional soldiers, many of whom he had trained and he knew their capabilities, and he knew he couldn't stand against all of them. And yet, how many of us have said words to this effect? Rescue me, God, for blank is way too strong for me. See, one of the things that step 1 forces us to do is not only say our life has become a prison, but this substance, this thing, this sin that's in my life is stronger than I am. He then continues in verse 7. He says, set me free from my prison that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. David, I'm sure, had this little fantasy working in his mind here where if God would just suddenly just set him free, just be able to put him back into the land of Israel, that the righteous, the godly men of Israel would gather around him, lift him up onto their shoulders, and carry him into the throne room, depose Saul, and without any effort on his part, David would become king. That's not how God works. It's definitely not how David's story turned out here. God did answer his prayer. He did send him men. In the middle of this desolate wilderness, somebody found out that David was there. And Samuel, in 1 Samuel 22, is where the story of the cave is. Men began to come and seek out David in order to join a community around him. Samuel lists them as being either discontent, downtrodden, or discouraged. Well, doesn't that sound like a fun group to hang around with all day? 400 downtrodden, discontent, and discouraged people join up with David there. And yet God begins to do a wonderful thing in all of their lives. Because you see, as David sat right then, he was a very able shepherd. He understood what to do with sheep on a day-in, day-out basis. He was a very capable military commander. He was excellent on the battlefield. He knew how to push men in order to get military victory. And yet he had no leadership skills whatsoever in governing or administering day-to-day life for people. And yet, faced with so many folks, 400, in a land of such scant resources, he was forced to learn some skills that were going to become invaluable later on in his life. Also, the 400, the names that are mentioned there throughout the rest of Samuel, starting in 22 and going all the way through the end of the book there, same names keep coming up. Of those 400, many of them became David's closest advisors when he did become king. They became commanders of his army when he did become king. Those friendships and that fellowship that was forged in the deep, dark cave lasted him the rest of his life. Just before Sabbath school, we have a little time of prayer, and we go around and we talk about something that we're thankful for. Frankie was in there. Friendships forged in deep, dark places. And I think of Jim and Evans and several others that were there when it was deep, dark, calm in the cave there. In the friendships that have stayed for the rest of my life, hopefully. David cries this prayer, and God answers it. I believe the prayer had been uttered many other times before this. David at least wrote it down, and that it was used as a basis all the way up to today for how many of us in our moment of step one, that epiphany that came to us that our life was indeed a prison, that the substance or whatever it was in our life was too great for us, uttered the prayer, Lord, rescue me, set me free. I know for a fact it was uttered by one of David's descendants. I don't know how many great-grandsons away it was, but I want you to turn in your Bibles to the book of 2 Chronicles. Now, it's toward the front of the Bible. If you're still in Psalms, it's about halfway between where you are now and the very front of the Bible. You'll hit either 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 33, and somebody with one of the black Bibles, holler out a page number when you get there.
321.
321. 2 Chronicles 33. 33. This is the story of one of the kings in Israel that I identify so closely with. Because you see, the story of David shows David starting and ending well. Now, he had some whoops, he had some slips along his way. He wasn't the perfect man. And yet he started so well, so close to God, and he continued being close to God all throughout his life until the very end of his life. And that, unfortunately, folks, is not my story. I did not start well. And that's why I love reading about this king in Israel, whose name his mama gave him was Manasseh. Now, I'm sure that's kind of a long name, and so all his family shortened that down, and any friend of his, any relative of his, just simply called him Manny. And so today we're just going to call him Manny here, okay? Manny had this wonderful, positive influence in his life while he was growing up. He happened to be the son of a king by the name of Hezekiah. And after so many kings in Israel that were just spiritually dead on the inside, Hezekiah brought in revival within the land of Israel. He purified the temple. He reinstituted the sacrifice. He brought back Passover and the other festivals. He continued bringing God back into the land of Israel. And Manny had this wonderful opportunity while he was growing up to see a godly man working and the blessings that came from that. And so Manny had a positive, godly influence in his life. And yet all too quickly, he became the king of Israel. And let's go ahead and begin reading in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 in verse 1. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. And he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. Nice long life here, okay? Verse 2. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nation the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. I've often thought about writing an autobiography, tentatively titled, "You're Welcome, Mankind." And yet the first part of my autobiography would have to have this title: Tom did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before Israel, he went right back to them. Now, it's at this point that I believe the writer in Chronicles thinks, you know what, that's not enough. You got to understand just how bad this guy was here. Because unlike other kings where it just simply says he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and then they go on to the next king, they go ahead and describe just how bad little Manny was. Let's continue reading here. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. He also erected altars to the Baals and made Asherah poles. He bowed down to all the starry host and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry host. He sacrificed his sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced sorcery, divination, witchcraft, consulted mediums and spiritualists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Manny was down for anything, okay? He had no restrictions whatsoever, except to do the next, it seems, wrong thing in the eyes of the Lord here. See, I submit to you that Manny would have been on top of step 7. He'd have been step 7 OT, okay? He was all about the good time. Just whatever the next wrong thing was, he was down for it. And you know, Paul writes that he was the king of sinners. Christ came to save sinners, of which I am foremost. I'm the king. I am their leader. And I know Paul had to know about Manny. But I would put it, pound for pound, act for act, that Manny was probably right up there with him. Okay? It was nothing that Manny wouldn't do. Just like us back in the day. Now, some of us read this and we're like, oh my word, well, see, I wasn't that bad. I never sacrificed one of my children. And he had a bunch of wives. He had a number of sons. It wasn't like he did all of them here, okay? But he sacrificed his children on some dead altar to a dead God. And we think, well, I never did that. Yeah, we did. How many of us had children? And we forsook that relationship with them so that we could spend a little more time on the altar of beam or meth or coke or whatever it was that got you off back in the day here, okay? Exact same thing as Manny. This provokes God to anger. But right now he's just in the provoking stage here, okay? Let's continue reading and see what set God over the edge here in young Manny's life. Verse 7. He took the carved image he had made and put it in God's temple, of which God had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen, out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." Yeah, I think that's not going to end well. Now, earlier, he had made altars to all the starry host and all these other gods, and he had said he put them in the temple. And yet what he was describing was the surrounding colonnades, the surrounding courts, the outer edges of the temple itself. This is saying he took an image and carved it like he wanted it, and he went into the holy place, and he set it right next to the ark. And he said, you know what? I'm going to worship that. Over the edge now, God goes. And we think, oh my word, well, I've never done anything like that. Don't you know that this is the temple that God has made? And how many of us put an image that we created in ourselves in there and decided to worship it rather than what this temple was made to do, which was worship the one true and holy God.
Amen.
Now, it doesn't say exactly what this image looked like. I don't know whether it was a bottle, could have been a pipe, might have been a dollar sign, or a car, or the outline of a female body. It was something that took the place of God in the very temple where he said, "My name resides." Let's continue reading. I'm going to skip down to verse 10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. Another common theme on open mic night is that people tried to tell us that this wasn't going to end well. People tried to tell us that we were in prison. And yet, to a one, we paid no attention to it. Having done all God could do, we continue reading here. So the Lord brought the army of the commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh prisoner, put a hook in his nose, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. This is how I believe Manny would be a wonderful Step 7 candidate, okay? Because most people, when they saw the first Assyrian chariot top the hill on the border of Israel, would have fallen on their knees and immediately tried to get right with God. But not Manny. No, he came. Some would have, as soon as the Syrian army circled Jerusalem, and they could see that this wasn't going to end well, would have fallen on their knees and repented to God, but not Manny. No, they took Manny captive. They got a hook and drove the spiked pointed end through the cartilage of his nose, put bronze shackles on his hands and his feet, looped a chain through everything, and drug him all the way to Babylon, and Manny still ain't realized that he's in prison. Okay? That's Step 7, folks, right there. That's a man that's going to go down with it. He gets to Babylon. Babylon is as far as you can get in the known world at this time from the city of Jerusalem. And he's all the way there, and he's still denying the fact that he's in prison. I don't know how long of a time span goes between verse 11 and verse 12. Maybe it was hours upon his arrival in Babylon. Maybe it was days. Knowing my life, it could have been months or years later. But suddenly, Manny wakes up one morning, and he looks around him, and he comes to the realization that his life has become a prison. He's as shocked as everyone that this has happened. Verse 12. In his distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. So he brought him back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is God. Coming to this realization, the very next thing he does is he gets on his knees, and it says he humbled himself a little bit here, okay? He just, he takes some ownership for this, but, there were some bad influences, he didn't quite, no, he humbled himself, it says, greatly. Taking full responsibility for everything he had done. He falls down, prostrate before God, and he prays a prayer. We don't know the exact prayer, but I got to believe that he knew the Psalms of his great-grandfather David. And he prayed something along the lines, "Rescue me, Lord, for this is too strong for me. Set me free from my prison." The next thing you know, and it doesn't say how long it was, but the king of Assyria just happened by Manny. And he said, "You know what, why don't you go on home? I don't know why I brought you all the way here to begin with." And Manny takes off for home. Desperation, restoration, brings about the knowledge that God is God in our lives. Manny heads back home. I want to continue reading here in 14. It says, afterward he rebuilt the outer wall of the city of David. west of the Gien Spring in the valley, as far as the entrance of the fish gate, and encircling the hill of Ophel. He made it much higher, and he stationed military commanders in all the fortified cities of Judah. 3 things that our step 1 brings about within our life. Number 1 is that humbleness. I must come to God in humility, understanding that my best efforts got me into the condition that I found myself in, which was prison. Having done that, Manny goes back, and the very first thing he does is he begins to strengthen the world around him so that he never becomes a prisoner again. See, if we don't do that in step 1, if we don't begin to erect walls and barriers and things that will keep us free from then on, we're just going to get in this cycle where we're repeating step 1 time after time after time. I've got to have walls built up around me. For many of us, those walls started with the walls of a sober living home within the ministry here. Physical barrier to the outside world so that I could put at bay what I used to be and work on what I need to be.
Amen.
I began to add to that military commanders, folks who will look out, and when they see something encroaching in on my life, have the authority to speak into my life and say, Tom, that might not end well if you continue going the way you're going here. Because you better believe once you've had the hook in your nose, you don't ever want to go back, and you carry that opening with you the rest of your life. It's a subtle reminder of who I don't want to be anymore. Step 1, humble yourself. Step 2, fortify yourself. And then Manny immediately goes into step 3 here. Verse 15. He got rid of the foreign gods and removed the image from the temple of the Lord, as well as all the altars he had built on the temple hill and in Jerusalem. He threw them out of the city, and he restored the altar of the Lord, sacrificing fellowship offerings, thank offerings on it. And he told Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. Folks, he purified his life. First thing he did was get rid of that image that he had put there. Okay, that's step 1. That's a necessary step, but it's only step 1 here, okay? He then proceeded to go throughout the city, everywhere he went. If there was a visible reminder of the way he used to be, it was outside the city. You just throw it on the garbage heap here, okay? And he continued to do that, all the while telling folks, you need to worship the God of Israel. Believe me, I know I got a t-shirt from Babylon to prove it here, okay? Manny spends the rest of his life, he ends well because he humbled himself, he fortified himself, and he purified himself. Step 1, in a nutshell, we recognized that our lives had become a prison. I'm going to ask you to turn one more time. Go ahead and go to the Gospel of John, chapter 8. Way to the right. Gospel of John, chapter 8. Gospel of John, chapter 8, starts off with the teachers of the law trying to trap Jesus using a woman that they had caught in adultery. Jesus publicly embarrasses them right there in the middle of the temple, and the whole rest of the chapter is the aftermath of that little incident. Because the teachers of the law are so infuriated that they decide they want to hurt Jesus back. They want to discredit Jesus. They want to get something on him so that they can say, see, we don't need to mind him at all. We don't need to pay any attention to his teachings. The end result is, it says in verse 30, that as people were going into the temple and they were watching this exchange going on, and they heard the accusations and they heard the teaching of Jesus, that more and more became aware that Jesus was who he said he was. Verse 31, one of my all-time favorites. Jesus basically turns his back on the teachers of the law. He's decided he's had enough of them. He's going to go ahead and teach the folks who have come to accept him. It says, to the Jews that had believed in him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you really are my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Singling these folks out, he says, here's the key. You want to fortify your life. You want to purify your life. Get into my teachings. Understand what I'm trying to get across to you here. Because through them you will understand truth. Having that truth, you will then be set free. Now the teachers of the law were infuriated at this point. Because Jesus is basically ignoring them now at this point. And so they claim, you know what? We have never been slaves of anyone. And Jesus could have stayed on the surface. He could have pointed out that there was 400 years where they were slaves in Egypt. There was 70 years where they were slaves in Babylon. And right now there's a bunch of Roman soldiers walking around the city, and you got to ask them before you can do anything. But he doesn't. 34. Jesus replies to them, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. See, it doesn't matter what your sin was. Could have been a substance, might have been a dollar sign, may have been female, could have been anything. We all struggle with sin. Open mic night, that would be a common theme that would go throughout. We all recognize, though, that sin, as big as it was, could only be defeated by calling on the Lord. David, in Psalms 142, uses, in the NIV renders it, O Lord. You may have noticed that several times. It says, O Lord. It's an honorific term for God. David wasn't calling in a cave for cuddly cute Jesus that petted the sheep and blessed the little children. He wanted the big buffy Jesus that was walking around with a whip, driving grown men out, yelling at the top of his lungs that my house will be called a house of prayer. That's who he was calling on to come save him. He wanted the biggest Jesus he could possibly get a hold of. Amen. In our moments of desperation, when we realized that we were slaves and prisoners of our sin, we cried out to Jesus. And we asked him to rescue us and to set us free. And therefore start our path toward recovery. Jesus ends his teaching on this particular point by giving just a little example here. He says, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son will belong to it forever. So if the son sets you free, Kirk Samuel's favorite line, you will be free indeed. Another common theme that will come out of open mic night is we went from a place of slavery, we went from a place of prison, from being shackled, either physically or emotionally, spiritually, some of us all three at the same time, to a place of freedom, where I am free today. But not only just free, folks, I'm free indeed. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for this opportunity. Lord, I just pray that we would dwell on these thoughts here this coming week. That, Lord, we would treasure the freedom that you have brought in each and every one of our lives when we prayed, rescue me, set me free from my prison. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.